Good to go. Hello, everybody. I'm just kind of opening a can, but it's not beer, I promise. Well, it's just lovely to see so many people on a dark January night. Thank you so much for coming out. We've got really important stuff to talk about, and you are really important people to engage with this stuff. So I hope you can hear me okay. Is the sound okay? Working okay? Fabulous. Okay, so I'm Harriet Green. I'm co-CEO of the Centre for Digital Public Services, CDPS. We were set up by Welsh Government to try to support the public sector to improve public services for everyone. And so tonight this is a really important topic because the for everyone bit is critical. We know that you don't generally have much of a choice but to use public services online quite often, and so it's really important that we get it right. So that's what tonight's event is about, to explore the topic of accessibility. What is accessibility? How do you improve accessibility? Why is that so important? So I've got some support here. I've got Rachel here who's going to help with signing, and I've got Gwynfor somewhere who's going to help with simultaneous translation. So, you know, if you want to speak in Welsh or English, be perfectly comfortable with that because we have got the simultaneous translation here. So I'm just going to say a little bit about accessibility because it is a technical term. We use it in the digital space and it probably is quite meaningful. You can probably intuit what it means, but there's quite a lot of legality around accessibility, as well as kind of, you know, the kind of the approach to improving public services that CDPS takes. It is a legal requirement to ensure that your services can be are accessible, usable equally by anyone who needs or wants to use them. And that is easier said than done, but there are tried and tested ways to achieve that. So we're not here to talk about the legality this evening. We're here to talk about, you know, why is it important and how do you work towards it? Because the discovery that we did at CDPS when we did our research into how we're doing on accessibility in our public services show that there's a really mixed picture, and that is absolutely common across the UK, and I'm going to stick my neck out and say the world, because designing public services is not the easiest thing to do anyway. Making them accessible, fantastic, really easy to use is tricky, and there are lots of skills involved. So we're all on a journey towards better, and that's what CDPS is here to help with. Mike's going to remind me in a minute to say that there are no fire drills scheduled. So if there is a fire drill, run like hell. Yes, no, don't run like hell. Yes. So that's what this evening is about. It's really great that you're all here because it means that you're taking this seriously. So when I think about public services and them working well, I always think about the person on a sofa with a mobile phone trying to access something which is they are entitled to, or they're required to do, or they need to do, whether that's book a visit to the dump, whether that's apply for a benefit, whether that's pay their tax online because they are required to do that. What's it like for that person on the sofa with a mobile phone trying to achieve that thing? And that is, you know, a mixed picture, as I said. But it's so for me, that kind of personal perspective is critical in terms of making us take this seriously. So we've got a couple of people who are going to come and join me and talk about their own personal perspective of using services. So Ellie and Steve, if you wouldn't mind coming up. And we've asked them to consider some thoughts around, you know, their experience of using services, because, you know, the reality of people trying to use services is really important for us to hold in mind. So Steve works for Sports Wales, really focused on ensuring that everyone has access to sport and physical activity. Ellie is from Media Cymru. Ellie has an autism and ADHD diagnosis and is also passionate about making sure that services do work for everyone. So I'm going to ask you both, I think I'll start with you, Ellie. So if you could give us your perspective on what it's like for you to use services at the moment, and then I'll probably ask you if there's one thing that you could improve, what might that be?
So I think my personal experience is that it's a complete and utter mixed bag when it comes to public services. It changes between organisation, and for some you can definitely tell that it's not a priority. And actually what I find is that it tends to be the most important ones that are the hardest to access, like health. So when I mean what's my experience, I'm talking about clunky and outdated systems. I'm talking about dead links on websites, and if you're lucky, you'll get out-of-date PDF docs with phone numbers that lead to nowhere. Processes which contain many unnecessary steps and hoops to jump through. Often these processes, you can tell they're kind of counterfeit as well. They're just process on top of process, and no one's gone back to start from the beginning and look at it all the way through. Forms that don't contain the correct language around disability, or won't let you, or anything, to be honest, correct language on forms. And most of the time, it's really complicated information which isn't easy to absorb, and when you're stuck, there's no one that you can call to ask for help, essentially.
And if there was one thing that you could improve, not that there is only one thing, there are many things to improve, but if you could pick one thing, what advice might you, or request might you make?
I am going to say two, I'm sorry. So the first one is that, for me, I think representation is really important. So if you can create accessible public services, part of that starts with creating accessible workplaces in the first place. So 1 in 4 people in Wales now identify as disabled. So if you're not working with someone like me and Steve, then that tells me that it's not a very nice place to work. And it's not a very nice place to work if you're a disabled person, and probably just in general it's not a very nice place to work. And if it's not a very nice place to work, how can I trust you to care about providing the services that I need and that I can access correctly? And then the second one is accessibility budgets. If you've got a ring-fence budget for Welsh language compliance, but you don't have one for accessibility, I think that needs to change, definitely.
So yeah, Steve, same question for you. What is your experience of using services, and if there was one thing you could change, what might that?
First, I just want to say I agree with everything you just said. I'm not sure there's that much to add, but I will try from a perspective of, so my experience of using, I'm pretty digitally savvy. I think I know my way around computers, laptops, iPhones, websites. So where I can, I will use digital services. And I think the key thing is where I can. So I would say, and I can't always. So a lot of the time we maybe focus, which is excellent, on the accessibility, the actual features. Can it do screen readers? Great, there's a lot of that, but sometimes the most simple thing, it can do all that, but then if it's hard to find that service that a disabled person might need, because it's buried in the bottom of a website, not where you might find it, or you go on the digital service, you get so far and you go, oh, if you need an adaptation to this service, phone this number. So while I've just spent 10 minutes going through the whole digital process, I want to access this service in the same way as everybody else does, maybe after office hours, because I have got a job and I'm busy, so I want to access that service at 8 o'clock at night, not potentially have to ring up between 9 and 2, because that's when the phone line's open, because I need an adaptation. So inclusive and accessible digital services are great, but it's not all about the assistive technology, it's also about the actual service that you provide. The assistive technology is very important, don't get me wrong, but that's the kind of gateway into accessing the service. If the service itself doesn't include people with disabilities, then is it really accessible?
Yeah, and so if there was something that could be changed, you would say that is obviously one thing that you would change.
Yeah, that would be one thing.
Yeah.
It's quite a big thing, but it would be nice for all services to be available digitally, not just services for people that maybe don't have a disability. So if you've got a specific access requirement, you quite often get we talked about processes. The process often goes, oh, computer can't help you with that. You need to speak to someone. Can you speak to someone on the digital platform? No, you've got to ring up between set time, which for certain people can create more access barriers if they need assistance in terms of using a phone or getting someone to speak for them, but then because they haven't got that assistive technology when they phone someone up, that can create another barrier.
Yeah. So I've got one more question for you both, but Steve, if I can ask you, I have this principle that if you are designing services that work for everyone, they actually work better for anyone. And I wonder what your comment on that would be.
Can't disagree with that. It's similar to when we teach sports coaches how to be inclusive in terms of delivering sport. The key message is it's just good coaching. If you coach and communicate well, it doesn't matter who comes to your session, you will be able to provide them with the opportunities. So similar, if you create good digital services from the outset, then they're most likely to be inclusive, and it'll save you time and money later on, because no one's going to be knocking at the door going, this isn't accessible, can you please change it? And then you have to kind of bolt things on, and that's where you get those duplicated processes that we've heard about and the dead links, because accessibility has been an afterthought, not a thought right at the outset when you were designing a product or process.
The same question, Ellie.
Yeah, definitely. I think just to sort of echo on your point is, of course, when we're designing accessible services, they are actually an extra bonus is that they work better for everyone, right? And I guess an example for me of where this happens, and I don't like to give too much credit, but recently I renewed my passport, and it was a fairly painless process, okay? And that's because UK Gov website, in my opinion, is an example of sort of best practice. But the reason it's so good is because in 2016 they hired a web expert, and they listened to him when he wanted to make changes, and they put a lot of investment behind it. And another thing that the UK Gov do on their website is that they conduct user testing with the elderly and disabled users on every page. And for me, it's very clear when I'm engaging with digital public services which ones have carried out user testing. But yeah.
Well, thank you both very much indeed for that, and please stay and be part of the conversation. But
switch to this mic here. I think we're having a little bit of trouble with the lapel, so if you can switch that one, they'll see that.
Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me on this one? Great. Okay, thank you both so much. And I'm going to invite our panel to come up and join us now. I think we're going to move those chairs forward. And just to say, we at CDPS, one of the things we do take really seriously is leadership, because it is leaders who make the decisions, who ask the questions, who take the investment choices that make things happen. And these Dolenni Digidol, these digital links meetings, are around supporting leaders across the sector to help them make decisions that will lead to better public services. So this is our 5th Dolenni Digidol. We do them all around the country. And the next one is in Swansea in March. I'll give you the date of that later. But yeah, that's our focus. But today's innovation is that we're actually live streaming this event on YouTube and LinkedIn. And as you all already have noticed, we'll be taking photographs throughout the event. If there's any issue with any of that for you, please talk to someone in the team. But yeah, we are being joined by people online tonight, which is very exciting. So, here is the wonderful panel. Okay, so I'm going to introduce each of you. We have Ry'n Bowen-Davies, who is the Older People's Commissioner for Wales. I think it's probably obvious why Ry'n is here, and will have strong opinions on this subject. Martin Jones, who is acting Equality and Human Rights Commissioner for Wales, and also works for South Wales Police as Equalities Lead. We have Joanna Goodwin, who is the Head of UCD and Delivery for CDPS, Centre for Digital Public Services, and Joanna is a really expert, well-informed champion around accessibility. And then we have Jack Garfinkel of the content design London agency. Jack is a passionate advocate for accessibility, an expert in accessibility, and used to work for the Scope charity. So I'm going to invite each of our panel in turn to give us some reflections on their experience, what has shaped their understanding of accessibility, and why we should have that kind of people focus, that, you know, as I see it, person on the sofa with a mobile phone trying to get something done focus in terms of the services that we provide. So, Ry'n, if you would give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, diolch. A noswaith dda pawb. I think I'd like to start by inviting you to think about a Wales where, regardless of age or ability, people can access public services that they need with dignity and ease. The digital world is now the front door to our public services. Many of those public services, health services, being able to access our local authority services, being able to access transport services. But what happens if that door is closed to individuals, particularly when we think about older people within our communities? And not thinking about older people within our communities now, but thinking about all of us in this room who hopefully will become older people in our communities, and what we are looking for and need and want from our public services. And if that door, that public door to our services, is too heavy to push open, too narrow to pass through, then we're failing in our duty to create accessible public services for everyone in Wales. Right now, 1 in 5 people in Wales are over the age of 65. Many of them talk to me about being able to access digital services. They're very confident and competent in terms of their digital skills, but many are not. And they speak to me about the barriers that they face on a daily basis, being able to go about their daily lives, being able to park in public car parks, being able to access a GP appointment, being able to book public transport or a community car. They also speak about websites that are difficult to access, difficult to navigate, text that's too small to read, forms that are confusing, or systems that assume digital competency. This isn't just an inconvenience for individuals. It can mean the difference between accessing essential services or feeling excluded and left behind in communities. Digital accessibility is not just about compliance or tick box. It's about people. And I think right from the beginning, when we're designing our public services, we need to start with that in mind. That's why digital accessibility must be a people-first priority in public service delivery, because public services must work for all of us, not just those who are digitally competent. But by prioritising accessibility, there are benefits far wider. We think about promoting independence. If people are digitally competent and have those digital skills, they can do things for themselves. They don't have to depend on others. Older people speak to me time and time again about frustration that they have to depend on others to do the things that they want to do for themselves to be able to live and age well. It reduces digital exclusion. In Wales, over 40% of people over the age of 75 don't have access to the internet because of costs, because of fear that's been created through scams and media coverage. So we're talking about a huge percentage of our population. We must make services simple, clear, and usable for all. But also from a public services perspective, it improves efficiencies. It can cut costs in terms of people not having to ring help centres because they can't access services, so it has benefits across society. Welsh Government has committed to an inclusive digital future, but we must go further. Digital accessibility can't be an afterthought. It has to be figured in right from the start. And that means designing websites, apps and services with larger text, clear language and easy navigation, always offering alternative access for individuals who can't or don't want to be on digital. Providing support and training for people to access digital services, and not training and support that we design. Listen to what people are saying that they want and need from their services, delivered locally by people they trust, and not feeling that they're always having to work towards an accreditation or a qualification. Make it work for them and what they want in their day-to-day lives. Invest in training for those who are developing our accessibility approaches, and prioritise accessibility within our public services. And just listening to what was said earlier, the importance of testing our services with those with lived experiences and then responding and improving that accessibility based on that feedback. As leaders in the room, you have the ability in your position and that authority to make accessibility a priority within your organisations, to drive this agenda forward. This is not just about technology and digital. This is about people. It's about making sure that every older person in Wales can access the support that they need without barriers, without frustration, and without fear of being left behind. Because an accessible Wales is an inclusive Wales, and an inclusive Wales is a stronger, fairer, and more compassionate Wales. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Ry'n. So, same question to you, Martin.
Well, I'll start by saying it's difficult to follow that. But I suppose it's probably useful just to explain the capacity that I'm speaking in. I'm, as has been introduced, the acting chair for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It's probably helpful for you to just understand who they are. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission is the UK regulator of the Equality Act. It's a national human rights institution. So a lot of what Ry'n's just described to you, the Commission has a national responsibility for looking at in terms of the way that's implemented in the public sector, which leads quite neatly into our regulation and enforcement role and what we feel in terms of the lack of digital inclusion across a number of protected characteristics that are stated in the Equality Act. We do see an absence of the use of public sector equality duty under the Act to actually assess the potential impact of your design of services. So lack of equality impact assessments, not thoroughly understanding that there is actually a duty to get this right on the part of public bodies. So this is something we would like to enable people to do far more efficiently. And that efficiency word is very important at this outset. It's absolutely well understood, I think, by us as a regulator and all other regulators, but all public services, that the efficiencies that can be obtained through moving to digital are very clear. The danger is the people that we leave behind. And we feel that our State of the Nation report, Is Wales Fairer, which is the devolved version of the Equalities and Human Rights Monitor that we published very recently, indicates that there are some enduring issues in this space. Older people, disabled people, some minority ethnic groups have a tendency to be the most likely to be digitally excluded. There is a socioeconomic deprivation matter here that intersects with a lot of that. If we're not understanding that when we're designing services, we are naturally excluding people, maybe not quite unwittingly, but it's through this lack of foresight and not really understanding some of the basic tenets of perhaps disability campaigning. So the social model of disability teaches you that disabled people, their inability to participate fully in society is not down to them. It is down to society's attitude and public services way that they deal with them. So the three central pillars of the social model are attitudinal barriers, institutional barriers, and environmental barriers. So we heard at the outset that when you redesign or make amendments to a public space to assist disabled people, lo and behold, families that have young children and have to push prams, all of a sudden that space is more easily accessible for them. So the point that was made in the outset, I think, is something we really need to capture and understand. When you get this right, you get it right for everyone. So I think going into the digital space, there's much we can learn, beg, borrow, and steal from what we already know about access issues anyway.
Thank you, Martin. Jo.
Hi. So I wanted to start a little bit of a background. So I started working in public sector digital about 20 years ago now. It was in a local authority in Wales, and my experience throughout the last 20 years has been very much along that, what do we need to do to tick the box? And I think this is where the people aspect really comes into that it's more than ticking the box or doing the minimum we have to do to meet the legal requirement. It's how it's going back to why do we run these public services in the first place? How do we serve the people we're trying to serve? So, and I've got a few examples of this as well. So when I was working in central government, the WCAG, the Web Accessibility Guidelines, very well established, international guidelines, very well applied, very well used, and implemented across government services. However, at the time, this was around 2014, social media was becoming more and more of an engagement tool across government. There were no guidelines or standards, and therefore there were no boxes to tick. So we weren't considering how we were using different digital tools to how to do that. So I found the right people in government, and we worked on it, and we developed the first ever social media guidelines for accessibility in the UK, and they've been widely adopted and used across UK central government and wider now. And I think that's really been part of my passion, and what's driven me the whole time is that it has to go further than ticking the box. It has to really consider how people are interacting with our services, how people who rely on us are interacting and engaging with us, and how much they do rely on us to do that. So it's more than ticking the box. It really is considering how people interact with government, how they need and rely on us, and what that end-to-end user journey is. It's not usually just a form or a portal or something they're interacting with us. There's a wider context in which people work with us. And by ensuring that we make our services accessible and inclusive, and considering and working with the people that may have different needs than our own, that we are designing those services that do what they're intended to do. It gives us those benefits then of actually doing the jobs that we're paid to do as well, delivering the services effectively and efficiently, saving us money, reducing avoidable contact, and serving those people within their own context. So I just wanted to finish as well on some on a real personal experience as well, that it's very difficult to talk openly about accessible and inclusive design freely. Quite often there's a little bit of uncertainty of, am I going to say the right thing? Am I being as inclusive as possible? And so just a real kind of personal plea from me of it's better to talk about it and get it wrong than to avoid the conversation. So that's really what I hope to get out of this today.
Thank you, Jo. Jack.
Hi, everyone. So accessibility be a person first thing. Could everyone hear me, by the way, at the back? Everyone good? It makes it immediate. It's like, can people use your thing? Can they understand your thing? Can they do that in the places where they need to do it, using the way they would the means they would normally do it? So that can be tech, but often a lot of that is situational. And the power of that is that you can influence people with power in a way that you can't with abstract guidelines or tick boxes. You can show people why it's not working, how it's not working, and what you can do about it. And you can use that to then move to a model where you start working in the open. So at Scope, we had an accessibility statement, but it was very different to other people's accessibility statements. It would list the things we knew were broken and that we were fixing them and how we were going to fix them. And in the content team, the content design team, we had a list of the stuff we were going to improve and how. And the reason we knew that is because we did do that testing, that situational testing and remote testing. Yeah, but by all means, go out and get that dedicated testing budget, Ellie. But if you don't, if you're working somewhere where you've got a helpline with people who are working with those on the front lines, like people will know. You'll have expertise in your organizations. They will know where the cracks are. So that's probably knowledge you already have. I think also if I'm going to make a pitch for that kind of practical kind of testing approach, I'd also say it's not either or in terms of using a legal approach for something like the public sector regulations, which sort of contain WCAG. It's a bit muddy, but they do. Or the European Accessibility Act, which doesn't have the hows in there, but it has the sort of the North Star of WCAG in it, the goals. If you focus on the practicalities, you will get there. It will make you better at doing that. And it's then you'll be able to follow the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law, and you'll be able to make a big difference. I'd say, again, to build on points other people made, like research and testing is one level of inclusion, and it's an important one, not least because it's broad. That's the best thing about it. You can the sorts of things that people have going on in their lives vary so much, and it can help you do that. But there are other levels, and they're also really important. So to go up like one level, you've got co-design, and then you've got colleagues. Like these people should be in design teams. We all put something of ourselves into our work. And if disabled people aren't part of your design team, then you're going to be missing so much, and you'll be able to fill in some of that with testing, but it's not going to be the same. And then ultimately, we need to look beyond that. Like we need disabled design leaders as well. We need more of them. There are already lots, but we need more. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, panel. Really kind of deep thoughts from each of you there, and some themes coming through as well. I think one of those is probably around if you make a service genuinely accessible, every user is going to benefit. But I don't know whether we want to explore that a little bit more, because I think there are some ways in which there are extra miles that you need to go for certain needs. So we're going to open the floor to questions, and we're going to have questions from those people who are joining us online too. I think our colleague Ionawr is looking across those. But I just wanted to say at this moment, I want to take this moment to say, I'm sure everyone in the room thinking, I really want my services to be accessible, and it is much easier to say than do. So I just wanted at this point to mention the service standard. And the service standard is an agreed set of standards for digital services in Wales, which have been curated by CDPS but have been adopted by the Welsh Government and Welsh public sector. And we have drawn on global experience over now decades about what makes a good service to put that digital service standard together. But again, okay, it's all very well to have standards, but how do you meet them? And CDPS is growing an offer, a support offer around how do I work towards that service standard? What kind of skills do I need? What kind of things do I need to take into account? We've heard about the importance of testing. So, that kind of, and I think, across Wales, we have a network of digital leads, including Lindsay Phillips, who we've got here from local government. We all are here to support leaders in the public sector on the how do I make stuff work better. So I'm going to open the floor to questions now. Would anyone like to ask our first question? We've got Mike. No? Where's your microphone, Mike? Mike on the mic? I've stolen your mic. Okay. So if anyone wants to ask the first question, I will then give you the mic. Mike.
Just to say, if people want to ask their questions in Welsh, obviously we got interpreter here this evening, and Ry'n is Welsh speaker. Isn't that right, Ry'n? There we go. So no pressure, Ry'n, but if you do want to answer back in Welsh, then we do have that. So Marco, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Marco from Promo Cymru. So I'm interested in the concept of the exclusion, etc. And we're talking about mobile phones, and I just thought, what would you think? So I find that the digital services that don't work are the ones that you go through it, and you don't know what to do. And so you think, what the hell am I going to do? And so then you look for a telephone number, and you can't find a telephone number. So in a sense, there's a questions there, and then so someone has to ring a telephone. But in terms of exclusion, if you sometimes, for an older person, they might be quite happy with the phone, but not happy with the digital version. So I think digital is about people, not just about the technology. And I think we've got to keep that in mind. Otherwise, I'm all for digital. I'm not against it in any way. But do you think that sort of rings true?
there's a wonderful book by someone called Lou Downs who talks about service design. And she makes an analogy of your service is what a thing does, helps you to do something, and the technology sits on top of that. And a good service will have layers of technology that you can fall back on. I'm old, so I know, I remember the early days of the web. There used to be something called progressive enhancement. And the idea is you would have a basic version of it and you would layer all the fancy stuff on it. And if it failed, it would fail gracefully. So the idea of that is you should be able to access a service through many mediums, through many technologies, and that should help you to meet your need in that moment. So some people will be phone people, some people will be instant text chat people, and some people want an app, some people want a desktop website. But like, it shouldn't matter. The service is the processes behind it, and it should be technology agnostic. I acknowledge that there's a cost factor, like it's, and that's okay. Like it's great if people can go through a digital version of something without experiencing friction, and the more people who can do that, the cheaper the service will be. But then, like, the more resources you've got left over for those other interactions, whether it's because a human has to be in the loop to make a decision, or you want a human to pick up a phone because that's what's most accessible to someone in that moment.
Joe. Add to that a little bit. It's really hard to deliver public services. There are increasingly constraints, financial constraints, and that is shifting a force to digital at the moment. It terrifies me personally that we are being forced to turn off some channels and force that digital interaction. It is exclusive, and it is a real problem and a real challenge that we're facing. So I think, you know, to look at it from that kind of leadership and that officer perspective, those people who are trying to design the best possible service they can within a really difficult environment and within the constraints they have in their team or their organisation at the moment, I think it's understanding that this isn't a nice to have. This is a necessity, and actually going back to that, if you design your service to be inclusive and accessible from the start, it will be cheaper, it will be more efficient, it will help you and your organisation deliver. And people don't live in one place. People don't just want to interact online or just interact over the phone. We are beautiful, complicated beings, and we have very vibrant lives. So having that flexibility and adaptability throughout your service is incredibly important as well, because no one person will interact with your service in one linear way. So understanding your users, what Jack was saying, engaging with them, understanding them, and not making assumptions for them is increasingly important.
Very quickly. Yeah, I'll just add that whole continuum point that was just made is absolutely essential to understand in the design of public services. And the Commission's view is that digital by default, or the move to digitalisation across the public services, has to be matched by an understanding of those who either cannot or will not engage with it. So you have to facilitate for that, because it's not going to go away. But I think that the flip side of this as well, just to get positive in quite early, that there is particularly from a disability perspective, a very positive side of technology, and embracing it. Some of the assistive technologies that are out there and their potential to assist people is incredible. So I think we don't want to get too bogged down in a whole negative narrative here. There is good to be derived from getting this done properly. But hopefully that addresses your question, Marco.
Yeah, and I think just one final point to add to the comments of the panel. I think it's about the public service being equitable to anybody, no matter how they choose to access that, whether that's by phone, whether that's asking for information, whether that's digital, that somebody shouldn't get less of a service because they are not online and can access that digitally.
The comment that you made about there being no phone number to contact, I mean, is that because there's an assumption that everybody will be able to manage online and or the digital, or any thoughts on that?
No, I think people have the right to access that information in numerous forms, so there can't be an assumption that people would be able to access online. And I think that's what older people speak to me about, is that they feel that there's an expectation that they should be able to access online, and that's expected of them, and they don't feel comfortable or safe or able or even want to. And I think we can't just exclude groups of our population because it doesn't suit how we as public services choose to deliver our services.
If the digital service is good enough and designed well enough, you wouldn't have to phone. But sometimes they're not designed well enough, so then you have to phone. And then but if you hide the phone, what are you saying? But
some individuals are not online.
Agreed.
So I think no matter how well you design those, they're not going to meet that group.
My name's Alma and I'm from Media Cymru within Cardiff University. So first of all, thanks to Ellie for focusing on user testing, because I think that's really, really important. And I think the panel's agreed as well. Maybe this is one for Centre for Digital Services. When you're working with organisations, what importance do you put on user testing? And is it a priority at the moment? And if it's not, how are you pushing that forward? And when you do user testing, are you going external totally? Nobody that has had any input into doing the form online or whatever. So, because obviously you'll know how it works. So say, for instance, postcodes and telephone numbers. You put your postcode in. Oh, hasn't gone through. Oh, is it because I've used lowercase? Does it need a space? Does it? So somebody who's designed it will know that straight away and wouldn't have that issue. So how do you overcome those problems with user testing?
So Joe, do you want to start?
Yeah, of course. So I am head of user-centered design, so I do lead the team of user researchers and designers at CDPS, who I would champion. They work incredibly hard to ensure all the projects and the work that we're doing is researched and tested with user and diverse users as well. So we do have processes and templates and all those sorts of things in place to make sure we consider the ethics and the diversity of our research and usability testing when we conduct that. We do have a lot of that available as well. So if in your organisation you're trying to understand how to better work with users, and that, please come and have a chat. We've got loads of resources and tools, templates and techniques that we're really happy to share with you. We also run the user research community of practice across Wales. It's got representatives from across Welsh public sector and beyond. Come along, talk to other researchers, talk to the people that are working with users. It's where we troubleshoot a lot of the problems. It's hard finding people. We are developing a research panel to help with that. And all of our recruitment for our research as well considers that diversity, and we challenge each other across government as well to make sure that we are being as representative as we possibly can. There's not a one-size-fits-all, but really happy to share kind of how we do it, some of the techniques that we use, and open that up more broadly as well. Jack, did you want to come in on this at all?
Right.
You're okay? Anyone else on the panel? No.
You think you know, but you don't know what is going to go on in someone else's head. What goes on in someone else's head is completely different to what goes on in your head. So there's those assumptions which are problematic. Okay, I think we have a question from our online audience.
We have a question from Samantha from our live stream. So she has said, Wales is becoming more ethnically diverse and a place of sanctuary. Public services are often people's first port of call. What is the appetite to have a language selection for all digital services which people may be more comfortable accessing?
To start, yeah, this is absolutely a point that the Equality and Human Rights Commission have made through the Wales Fairer and Equality and Human Rights Monitor at a UK level. Digital services have to fit, as is described in the question, an increasingly diverse nation, and having accessibility considerations for people whose first language is not English or Welsh is absolutely central to this. So I think it's critical that that point's been made. And just picking up the point, I think that's been made more generally, or a theme that's coming out, in my day job in the police, we've put a lot of time and energy into public engagement. Obviously, trust and confidence across UK policing is a huge issue, but we understand that you have to sense check what you're about to do or what you're proposing to do. And that's absolutely linked to effective use of the quality impact assessments. You have to consult, you have to engage. I see no reason why that principle doesn't apply in digital accessibility and the design and delivery of public services.
I think just to add to that point, I think we've spoken about older people, people living with a disability, but I think when we're thinking about accessibility, it's about thinking about the intersectionality of our population as well. That an individual may have multiple protected characteristics that can create multiple barriers in terms of being able to access public services. So when we're thinking about testing those digital platforms, when we're thinking about designing services, again, it's not just thinking about one protected characteristics, but thinking about a whole range of protected characteristics that could create further and multiple barriers for people accessing.
I'm going to line you up for one, actually, Jack. So it is going across seeing the person behind that and making sure that you understand your users and what their needs are. The reason I said I'm lining Jack up is because I wanted to really bang the plain language drum. We've got some trio writing books here today as well in terms of the easier it is to understand your content in English, the easier it is to then translate. And a lot of people, through my experience, who a first language isn't English or Welsh, will have some way of interacting with your service because they need to every day, not just for how they interact with your organisation, but wider. The easier your content is to understand, the easier those tools and the machine learning and all the technology that's coming through can translate that. If we have very highly complicated language, which is full of jargon and localized language, those tools will not be able to translate that effectively. So the more plain language it is, the easier it is for them to interact and more likely to reach their readability level for English as well. But Jack, you're the content expert, so...
It's very kind of you, Joe. Thank you. Language can be complicated in all sorts of ways, and everyone's trying their best. I don't want to be give you all a hard time. Everyone's starting somewhere, but I think the most important thing is to set out to accept that you could be using plainer language and find out where you need to do that. Every service, no matter how well designed, have something that they can improve. Testing is one way. We've talked about that. So things like highlighted testing or scenario testing. Come and find me and I'll bend your ear about that if you want to talk about it. But there are other ways, if you don't have those resources, where you can get started. Just looking at the pages in your analytics, the pages people are looking at before they go to your Contact Us page. That's it's a shallow signal, but it's quite a clear one that people looked at a thing and they decided they had to contact you. So I was working on a local government project recently, and that the brief was to reduce the number of calls they were getting, to help people to self-serve as much as was possible, not to stop them finding the phone number, but to stop them needing to. And that's something you can do, even if you've got no budget. And again, I've got a blog post about it, but I'll be happy to talk your ear off about it afterwards if you're a Google Analytics person.
So you're saying, Jack, that the best way to stop people using you is to take the phone number off. The second best way is to make your services work easily.
Yeah, but also, I mean, the short answer is yes. The longer answer I'd like to give now, it's people experience things as complex in so many ways, and that's so interesting, and is so deep, and that is the joy of the job. And we've all, you're all doing your best, and we could all do more, and that there are ways you can do that.
Great. Okay, I think we've got a question here, so I'll hand you the mic.
Thank you. Hi, Jo Lovell from Compass, and responsible for digital inclusion in Wales. well, I guess most of it delivering the current programme. My question is, public services are probably the biggest employer across Wales. So the amount of employees that work within public services, who have families, who have friends, what work is done to support them to be able to access public services? Because from the digital skills audits we've done with local authorities, with health boards, the assumption that staff have the skills they're required to engage isn't necessarily what skills people actually have. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the whole transformation agenda, in terms of accessibility, what support is there for employee? And I'm not a public sector employee, by the way, but I'm just thinking about the size and the scale, and if they're being engaged in that process of designing services, because if they're on board and they find them accessible and easy to use, then they're going to go and show their family how to use them and encourage people to use it, which helps you then deliver better public services. So open to whoever wants to take that one on. Thanks.
So the only way I can address that is by excuse me, referring to my day job. Really, I'm responsible for the staff support networks that we have in my force, and that's an area where we're seeing a huge proliferation. So with the advent of kind of employee activism, it is very clear in public services that your employees tell you when they're dissatisfied now. You know, I'm old enough to have remembered that the light's only been on for 3-4 days in the 70s, and I think a lot of us who are of that age never thought we'd see strikes and union activity the way we've seen it recently, but there is an appetite for that again following COVID. And I think employers, particularly public service employers, who don't listen to their employees and actually put in place infrastructure to facilitate that, for that internal voice to come through, to hear how your people feel about how you're designing and delivering your services, is something that we're absolutely alive to in policing. I can't speak to how that looks across other public services, but it's certainly something that policing is very aware of.
You used a word which I wanted to pick up on, which was assumptions, and I think a lot of the work we do and the environment we're working in is then leading into assumptions. So challenge them wholeheartedly, you know, be curious, go out there and find some of those answers of why aren't we, what are those barriers to doing that. And I think coming back as well to that, you know, we have a duty to make sure that we're designing our services as inclusive as we can, and we do have people in our teams that we can talk to and we can learn from one another. So yes, I think coming back to that point you made around we're making assumptions, I don't know if those organisations and those teams are talking to their families or their relatives. I don't know if they're bringing any of those insights back, but it's a great question and something I think really worth exploring.
I saw another couple of hands go up. I don't know who was next, but I'll leave it to you, Mike.
Well, I do know Fernando. He works together on an event, so I'll come to Fernando and I'll come to you next.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yep. So Fernando from Cardiff University, Director of Data Science Academy. So a lot of the work that we're doing is now to help is with AI. And the way that it works is you don't have a phone, but you have somebody 24/7. And you can customize your questions and say, I want to know the answer to this question. It will not just give you a search result where you have to figure out why it's giving you that search result, but it'll customize an answer to it. Go here, press that. On this page, you'll find this, do that. You can ask questions in any language you want. You'll get answers in any language you want. And you can actually say to it, dumb down the answer. I didn't understand it, or I don't understand this part. Say it differently. So it's proving to be quite effective in helping, at least, or in becoming more inclusive. Even if there's no intervention, if there's no phone number, that's a major strategy that most people are using now internationally. So the question I would say is there an AI strategy in place now to be implemented going forward, so that all the questions I'm hearing now might become easier and more approachable?
Shall we go? Do you want to go? I think that's a really interesting question. I think I'm currently consulting on my priorities and programme of work as Commissioner, and the conversations that I'm having with people is, where does AI sit within those priorities? How does that underpin any of our work that we do going forward in terms of thinking about the technological advances and AI and the opportunities that AI offers in terms of, I think somebody mentioned earlier, the support around promoting independence for individuals. But I think really understanding some of the risks and concerns that individuals have around AI, because that when I'm speaking with older people, there is a real fear, and that may come from, we don't really understand what it can offer, but I think having that balance, and I think when you were asking the question, my thought came back to how is AI and technological advances sort of underpinning all our thinking at the moment, and where does it figure in terms of national and local policy and decision making, and the opportunities as well as mitigating those risks.
In terms of, is there a strategy? No, but there's a lot of work happening around that, I think, in short. Some of the health boards in Wales at the moment are doing some really, through their diversity and inclusion programmes as well, some really interesting work around how AI can be used to free up clinician time and to improve the consistency of clinician and care across different health boards. So really exciting conversations happening at the moment. What we haven't got, though, is yet the understanding of what the ethics and the data requirements are around that. There's some work to do there to make sure that we get that right before we roll out any new technology or any new tools, regardless whether it's machine learning, AI, or any other technology. But there's a lot of excitement and activity happening to help with that. I think for me, it's making sure that we keep the person at the heart of that work. It's very easy to get excited about technology and the opportunities for us as service providers, or how it can make our lives easier. I mentioned how we could possibly free up clinician time, but what does that mean for the patient and the client and their families, and not just the health board delivering that service?
And I think that cautionary element that you just heard there and heard from Ry'n is the Equality and Human Rights Commission's interest in this. The potential that AI offers is huge, but the Equality and Human Rights Commission at a national and devolved level has identified that AI does offer potential challenges from an equality and human rights perspective as well. And they have to be really well understood before we see an extensive rollout, an uptake of AI driving public services.
Anyone got anything else to say about the public service angle? Or I'll talk about the design angle. So I look at AI at the moment through the lens of like the dot-com boom, because it's something I remember. It's different in many ways, but the one way I see it as being similar is there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of interest, and it revolves around tech, and there are real things in there. Like, this is going to have a material change on how we do things, but it's very hard to filter out the noise and the risks at the moment. And the way I manage that is by looking for clever people doing really boring work that isn't tied into like VC funding or building their profiles, so that there are people in the content design space like building knowledge graphs to help AIs understand, to calculate context in a specific way, which is more helpful for specific subjects. And there are people training AI agents and testing them and looking at the ethical considerations. There's someone called Dan Howarth. He was at DWP. I think he's moved on since. But yeah, he'll talk about knowledge graphs for days. And those are the people I look to at the moment. Yeah.
Me. Hi, I'm Gwendolyn from the Co-Production Network for Wales. So I'm going to bring us back to like real people rather than AI a little bit more. You've mentioned a lot, I think, at the very beginning around sort of what I would say is the co-production imperative around co-design and bringing people in and designing with people. But I'm wondering about the potential of digital services and the co-delivery of services and how that can match around accessibility. So I'm thinking a lot of the time with the way we've been talking about these digital services, it feels like it's one person in a room just with their computer and, thinking about how digitally that can be accessible to someone. But actually,
how we use the digital to actually deliver services together with each other, and where we might be accessing a community space where we would use the digital service alongside, sitting and having a tea, a tea morning with a bunch of older women, for example. How do you see those two marrying together, and what do you see actually happening in Wales at the moment around that?
I'm happy to start. I forgot that's where you were now, Gwen, and if no one had mentioned the word co-production, I'd committed to myself to throw it in at some point, just to remind ourselves that we are in Wales and we do have an understanding and kind of a commitment to that way of working that perhaps is not seen in other parts of the UK. I think what you're describing pretty much connects with what I described earlier about engaging people, taking them on the journey as you reconfigure and redesign public services. And as I say, I think there's more of an appetite and understanding of what that looks like and could look like in Wales. It's definitely co-production's written all over the Welsh Government's disability action plan, its LGBT action plan, all the protected characteristic action plans that our devolved government generates have as a founding principle co-productive principles. So I think if we don't seize them and truly understand how they can assist us to design better and deliver better, we're kind of speaking with forked tongue, aren't we? We're committing to stuff that perhaps we don't fully understand.
I think using a really practical example, and people in the room may be familiar with age-friendly communities that are established in Wales. I think these are a really good example of where co-production has delivered really tangible, positive outcomes, not only for older people in their communities, but for others within the community. And for those that it may not be as familiar, age-friendly communities is based around the principles of co-production, and it looks at 8 different ways of 8 different domains, as they're called. So we're thinking about transport, we're thinking about service delivery, we're thinking about civic participation and housing. So all those public services that our lives are in contact with on a daily basis, and working with older people in the community and representatives of each of those domains to actually design and deliver services to meet the needs of older people. But the principle at the heart of that is around co-production. And so I think that is a really practical example of where services have been designed and delivered and co-produced with older people and are being delivered in communities.
Yeah, just to add to that is a lot of our services are co-delivered. We probably just don't think of them that way. I mentioned earlier in terms of that end-to-end user journey through any of our services. So if you face financial hardship, you're unlikely just to engage with one government body. You're likely to engage with charities or the Citizens Advice Bureau. There's lots of other agents in that end-to-end user journey, and it's not going to be a one transaction or one service. If you're facing that financial hardship, you might have council tax reduction, you might have different benefits delivered by a devolved arm's length body in Wales, for example. You might have healthcare benefits, free dental care, for example. So our services they're not linear. They are accessed by people going through something that they're doing in their life at that time. Just a simple, I'm going home from hospital after an operation. You will interact with multiple government organisations, charities, and potentially private sector. So our services are already delivered by more than one provider. We just haven't thought about it or designed it to enable that to happen.
So there are lots of ways to do co-production, and that's good. Like, diversity is good. My co-design mentor at Scope used to always ask me to hang on to 2 questions, and one is, what is the transaction in this relationship? And it is transactional, and that's okay, but be clear about what's being exchanged, and where is the power? And if there's no power with disabled people, then that's not co-production. That's something else. Disabled people. And the other thing, intersectional approaches get talked about a lot, and obviously by definition there are many dimensions. But one of the main ones I'd like to highlight is class. So if you have a co-production system which rewards people who are already steeped in coded behaviors, like how a meeting works, what language is seen as aggressive and what language is not seen as aggressive, like they're gonna have an advantage. And if they're in a room with people who don't know how to do that, then they're gonna get drowned out. So, and these are solvable challenges, but they require sensitivity and like really good sharing. Like it's quite old school, but it can go a long way.
We've got one more question. Thank you so much. I'm Ry'n and I'm the manager of the Rare Disease Implementation Network in Wales, so I work within the NHS. I've got a very fortunate position, but also a lot of challenges. The rare disease population in Wales are an underserved community that are diverse but very common. So there's 200,000 people in Wales with a rare disease, and most of them don't have any clinical service provision, and they're hidden. We're developing a digital rare care centre to be able to reach out and access these people and give them a level of support, peer support, communities. We're really lucky that we've got a global platform that has allowed us to build that free from philanthropic funding, and they have got a huge amount of wealth of understanding about accessibility and how we can reach into these communities. But we've also got a huge level of challenges as well. So we've co-produced it with our population, but we've got a limited number of them. And our focus at the moment is on learning disabilities and people with cognitive impairments because of the rare disease element. Also ethnic minorities because of the rare disease conditions that impact on those communities. Things like ageing, things like some of the other disabilities they've talked about, I wonder whether either we're missing a trick or I haven't been aware of them, so therefore I haven't looked into them in more detail. And my question really is, when we do deliver this digital rare care centre, that we hope in the future will have an in-person component as well, just to support everybody. Is there anywhere externally that I can send it to be proofed, in the sense that it's the people that we're working with are grateful for any support that they get because they have nothing. So are they going to be critical enough? Are they going to know the things that they should be looking for to help us improve what we're doing? Because I wonder whether, if, again, talking back to generations, if we're asking people that have nothing, if it's a good service, then they're going to say yes, irrespective of whether they can find what they need and how they want to work. So it'd be really good to have that kind of reassurance that I can send it to somebody who really knows what it should look like or how accessible it is, so that we can be confident that we can access everybody, really.
I think so, but I'd like to
Very quickly, I'd suggest that you engage with your equalities lead in your health board, because they should be able to get alongside you and assist with an effective equality impact assessment of the process you're about to implement. And I'm sure the Equality and Human Rights Commission might be able to assist if there isn't that functionality in your health board, which I doubt. We might be able to at least share guidance on how to do a good and effective equality impact assessment.
Hi. So there are two things I might suggest that you could maybe do yourself, or with a little help. One is to soften the cue you give people to give you feedback. So one of the most kind of a good test to start with is something called a highlighter test, which is when you print out the content and you give people a green highlighter, for example, and a red highlighter, and say, the bits that you find hard to understand, could you highlight those in red and talk to me about them? And that's good because it's physical, and you've already accepted implicitly in the question that some bits will be easier to understand than others. And the other thing I'd advise is lies. which is you sit down, you have a script. It's quite common. It's better if it's true, but you can like say, I didn't write this, but I work in the same organization as the people that do, and they want to make it really good. Can you carry out this test, whether it's a highlighter test or something like a scenario test, to create that distance? Because you're right, that does creep into testing, and you do need to create that distance for it to work.
Creative solutions there. Thank you very much. So I think we've got a question which is coming in that Ry'n is going to read out for us in Welsh and answer in Welsh, I think. Thank you.
All right, yeah, if we could just get the headsets. We've got a question that's come in from the live stream in Welsh. So, yeah, Ry'n, if you're okay to say what the question was and then, yeah, respond in Welsh, that'd be great. So if you just turn it on, switch it to on, and then bring forward to the
O, grêt. Mae'r cwestiwn sydd dod mewn... sori, na I just aros. Mae'r cwestiwn sydd dod mewn yn gofyn sut allwn ni newid y meddylfryd o amgylch hygyrchedd a wneud yn flaenoriaeth. Dwi'n credu mae hwnna'n cwestiwn dilys iawn o ran meddwl sut dyn ni'n newid ein meddylfryd ni yn y gwasanaethau cyhoeddus i sicrhau fod arweinwyr a gwasanaethau o fewn yn gwasanaethau cyhoeddus ni yn gallu blaenoriaethu hygyrchedd. Dwi'n credu nath ni sôn am hyn yn gynharach o ran meddwl am buddiannau sy'n gallu ddod o wella hygyrchedd yn ein gwasanaethau cyhoeddus. So meddwl am gwahaniaethau o ran gwasanaeth cyhoeddus i bawb, a os mae'r gwasanaeth cyhoeddus yn gweithio i bawb, mae hwnna'n golygu gall pawb cael gafel o'r gwybodaeth sydd eisiau, cael gafel o'r gwasanaethau sydd eisiau, a mae hwnna'n mynd i o ran hir dymor fallu lleihau costiau bobl, gwella effeithlonrwydd ein gwasanaethau cyhoeddus. Ond mae'n rhaid i ni wneud yr achos ar gyfer hynny, a dwi'n credu falle dyna lle mae'r canolfan yn dod mewn o ran creu'r tystiolaeth o sut mae hyn yn gweithio, ble mae hyn yn gweithio, beth yw'r enghreifftiau da o hyn yn gweithio, fe gallwch chi wedyn rhannu hwnna gyda gwasanaethau cyhoeddus mwyn i ni'n gweld y buddiannau sy'n gallu ddod o wella hygyrchedd, nid yn unig i nhw fel gwasanaeth, ond i bawb yn y gymdeithas sy'n gallu wedyn cael gafel o'r gwasanaeth yna.
Yeah, I think that question around proving the benefit is absolutely critical, because we're advocating, we're describing benefits. We absolutely need to have the data, chapter and verse, which proves that all of these benefits that we're, describing, and, I think probably very persuasively actually come through. And actually, I think there's so much which is built around this. We were talking earlier, Ry'n, about how if you're an older person and you go into town and you have to use an app to park, and you don't want to use the app to park, you're far less likely to go into town, you're more likely to be more socially isolated, you're not going to spend the money in town. There's so much that is actually dependent on getting this right in ways that we probably don't quite understand as yet, but it's really important to gather the evidence and state the evidence and be clear with everybody that the benefits we're describing here probably go way beyond just, that person being able to use the service. It's the ripples are, it's kind of, if you say, well, digital is the way that people are going to manage their lives, you understand how huge it is. And how important it is that we get this right, because if it's going to be the online equivalent of how we communicate from day to day and how we work together in day to day, it's obviously critically important. So I'm going to ask just one more question, if that's okay, because we started at the beginning and we made the point a few times that if you improve accessibility of a service for people with particular requirements, it's going to be a better service for everybody. But I'm going to kind of slightly challenge myself on that, because I think in some ways, it's great, let's improve it for all of us who, those of us who don't have those special requirements. But hang on a minute, there are people who do have particular requirements, and I think it's probably in a sense not good enough to just say let's just make it better for everyone, because we actually do have to pay attention to particular requirements of particular groups to get this right. I just wondered if you had a comment on that.
I think I'm probably going to go back to the point in the previous response and talk about data and what we know about our communities and the people who live in our communities, so that we start to understand what the needs of our community is in a far greater detail, and that then we're able then to design our services with those individuals at the forefront. It goes back to the point we made right at the beginning, that our public services are designed from the beginning as a person-centred and with that person-focused approach. I think when we do that and shift that mindset, then I think we start that journey in terms of prioritising accessibility and making accessibility real in terms of how citizens are experiencing that.
Yeah, leading directly on from that, I think, from the Equality and Human Rights Commission's perspective, making more efficient use, as I said at the outset, of a public sector equality duty, how that actually enables you to design and deliver better services. It isn't just about compliance. The Commission itself is an enforcement agency and a regulator, but it's also an enabler. It wants to see better public services, and it wants to see the legislation better understood and better used to actually assist in the design and delivery of better services. So I think understanding that legislation is there to help you, and sticking with a kind of litigious kind of commentary. Let's not forget when there are consequences for getting this wrong. It's not just about leaving people behind and the human rights and equalities implications of that. There are complaints, and if you look at it internally, going back to your question, potential equality tribunals that will arise from this if you don't understand and grip it correctly. So I think that would be the Equality and Human Rights Commission's final words in this space, is get back to basics, learn how the PSED of the Equality Act can assist you to do this as best as you possibly can.
I think the question is, are you excluding somebody? I think that's the question I wanted to kind of pick up on. There are so many ways you can make your services more accessible that then doesn't exclude anyone. So if we look at things like font size or good colour contrast or plain language, by doing those things, you're making your service more accessible, but you're not leaving anyone out. So I think it does come back to understanding your users and making sure that you are engaging with them. I'm sure there are examples where you're maybe in a legal context or working with finance or even a clinician where you have to use specific terminology and you cannot use plain language because it means something different, and you have to have that need. So understanding the audience and the users around that and making that very conscious decision to open that up or not for a specific purpose. So understanding what your user needs are, your business and your organisation requirements, the policy context as well, and then making really conscious, informed design decisions.
Oh, that's a deep question. Some people will need specific things, not just a better universal thing. Yeah. I think it's interesting because there's often, not so much with this question, but often around accessibility, there's a quiet part to the question. Like, you're all here because you're interested in accessibility. There's going to be a new idea that people might need a BSL or an easy read version of your stuff, but we don't do it. I think why is the interesting bit. I don't have an answer for you.
Is this on? Sorry, is this on? Okay, right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I really feel like we've explored this topic and also really kind of felt the importance of it through so many different examples that you've given us. So thank you so much to our panel, Jack, Joe, Martin and Ry'n. I want to thank Rachel, who's been interpreting for us, and Gwynfor, and also to Ellie and Steve. Thank you so much for kind of bringing alive what it's like to be using not necessarily satisfactory services. Hopefully you're all filled with, inspired to understand more. CDPS is making available some leadership training
in accessibility. You know, where do you start? What is the support that's available? What are the first steps to take, and where do you go? And perhaps some better insights into the compliance responsibilities that we have as leaders. And that launches in March. You can register for it right now over there if you want, or you can look at the CDPS website. And in fact, we will follow up with an email to everybody here to offer you that leadership training. I mentioned the next Dolenni Digidol, that's in Swansea on the 26th of March. And we wondered if we could ask you through this QR code, if you wish, to answer a question that we have, which is, what is an action that you could take when you go back to your organisation to take those steps around accessibility? We're just interested in what you think in your organisation could be a real thing that you could go back and do. That will help inform us in terms of what we provide for support, and potentially members of the panel too, in terms of supporting organisations to improve accessibility. Thank you so much for coming. We've got the room for another half hour or so. There's a drink, please chat. And yeah, thank you so much, and thank you again to our panel.